Ladies and gentlemen, today, July 29, our public association Dignity, or Kadir Kasiyet, invited you to the presentation of a research on UN Security Council reform. Although this research was supported by the Sigrid Rousing Trust, please note that the content, conclusions, and recommendations do not necessarily reflect or coincide with the views of this donor. Thank you for your interest. We believe the right to peace as a third generation right is extremely important for everyone. But how can we, human rights defenders, um, contribute to the promotion of peace? We thought our research might be helpful. The result of research are intended for high-level politicians and diplomats, employees of international organizations, academics, human rights defenders, journalists, and ordinary citizens. Today's speaker is Inzhu TINALI, a young researcher from Kazakhstan who assists our organization with analysis. She graduated from a university in Germany and specialized in international relations and international law. Although she's only 20 years old, as a teenager, she founded the Children's Committee on Human Rights in Kazakhstan 4 years ago, one of whose success is the criminalization of bullying in our country. Before we hand over to a speaker, let me inform you that the presentation is being streamed live in our YouTube channel, Dignity 5351, and the recording will be available there if you'd like to share or rewatch today's broadcast. We plan for the presentation to last approximately 1 hour, after which we will offer time for questions, comment, your opinions, and discussions. Inzhu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. My greetings, everyone. And my research on today's topic is the answering the research question: to what extent does veto power shape the effectiveness of negotiation within the United Nations Security Council, as demonstrated by the deliberations on the draft resolution of ceasefire in Gaza in 2025? Next slide, please. The contents of today's research presentation is going to be historical background on the relationships between Israel and Palestine, introduction to the structure of United Nations Security Council, US consistency in its handling of negotiations over the resolutions, deliberative legitimacy of UNSC structure, formal institutionalization of normative diplomacy, internalization of norms, veto power in the collective agreement of UNSC, and conclusion and recommendations to the reformation of UN Security Council in the end. In terms of the research, it examines the conflict in the Gaza Strip between Israel and Palestine, particularly the proposition of resolution on ceasefire on 4th of June and 18th of September of 2025 as a formal solution to minimize the violence. The draft resolution was issued with the sponsorship of 10 elected UNSC members with a demand for release of hostages, resuming of the flow of humanitarian aid and ceasefire. 14 members state voted in favor, except for the USA, one of the 5 permanent UNSC member states, whose veto power hindered the adoption of the draft resolutions. And my research evaluates effectiveness of negotiations based on the institutionalization of normative diplomacy, validity of conduct of deliberative diplomacy, and outcomes of diplomatic signaling within the UNSC. Next slide, please. First is going to be the historical background between the relationships of Palestine and Israel. Palestine hadn't obtained independence under United Kingdom administration since 1922 due to the Balfour Declaration proclaiming Palestine as a national home for Jews. So the Arab strife for independence and resistance to Jewish immigration led to perpetuated violence. As the issue had been turned to the UN in 1947, the British mandate was terminated and Palestine was separated into Arab and Jewish states under the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine, according to Resolution 181. Following the 1967 war, Israel occupied Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, causing the second exodus of 500,000 Palestinians and resulting in the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. And it called for withdrawal, the measures for restoration of just peace. Subsequent UNSC Resolution 338, invoking for peace negotiations and General Assembly reaffirmation in 1974 and 1975, endorsed Palestinians' rights to self-determination, national independence, sovereignty, return, and granted Palestinian Liberation Organization the observer status in the Assembly. As a result, the 1970 Declaration of Principles of International Law Tracing Diplomacy concerning friendly relations informs on the establishment of a sovereign and independent state or any political status of a state determined by people. Now, the self-determination principle must be perceived in complementation with the principles of non-intervention, prohibition of the use of force, and equality of states. The UNSC peace initiatives proved to lack enforcement of compliance in practice, even so some legal responsibilities of states involved in the conflict had been defined. The PLO was established in 1964 to represent the nationalist movement of centralized Palestinians after their dispersion across various Arab states due to Israel expansion. Its covenant set out goals to the destruction of the Israeli states and elimination of its sovereignty in Palestine. The prominence of the covenant partially led to the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel to target the PLO, and the PLO had been engaged in guerrilla war with Israel before accepting negotiations for peace at the conference convened in Madrid in 1991. Negotiations reflected the mutual recognition between Israel and PLO in the 1993 Oslo Accords, comprising elucidation on the restricted Palestinian self-rule and election of Palestinian Authority body. However, negotiations on final status, issues like borders of future Palestinian states, spread of Jerusalem, security of returning refugees, and Israeli settlement in occupied territories, it all failed despite continuous UN involvement. Thus, peace efforts of United Nations Security Council had been continuously undermined by conflict escalations between Israel and Palestine, highlighting the fragility of peace enforcement methods, which were limited to negotiations and subsequently normative decrees that weren't conformed to in practice. Thus, peace efforts taken into account in 2003, like Israel's 2005 withdrawal from Gaza, were discredited by takeover of Gaza by Hamas in 2007, and the Operation Cast Lead. During the 2008 and 2009 war between Israel and Hamas, 1,400 Palestinians were killed, inducing deliberate destructions that couldn't be justified as necessary. Despite the peace efforts, violations of international law weren't addressed either. So United Nations Security Council Resolution 1860 called for immediate ceasefire, recognizes Gaza as a part of Palestinian state, and condemns armed forces for indiscriminate attacks on civilians and blockade for restriction of humanitarian aid in the sector. Although Resolution 1860 was adopted in January 2009, the Goldstone report, which was released in September 2009, provided evidence of war crimes and nearly war crimes against humanity committed by Israel under international law during the Operation Cast Lead, without issuing an official legal conviction. Yet there had been no definitive legal consequences for violations stated in the Goldstone report, which displayed a significant breach in the international accountability mechanisms. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict had lasted from 2009, so it was accompanied by Palestine's upgraded UN status to non-member observer state in 2012, which allowed Palestine to engage in UN public sessions without voting. The UNSC Resolution 2334, which condemned Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, was adopted. And it depicted East Jerusalem as part of occupied Palestine, not recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the city and considering settlements there to be transparent violation of international law. Nevertheless, the US proclaimed the city as Israel's capital without acknowledging the outcomes of unfinished negotiations in 2017, which displayed a political alignment towards the bilateral relationship of the US and Israel under the Trump administration, considering that previous US presidents delayed the relocation of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Thus, the US could no longer be viewed as a neutral mediator in peace negotiations, leading to international controversy and subsequent constraints imposed by the US veto power on draft resolution from 2017 to 2025, condemning Israel for asserting Palestinian sovereignty over Gaza, indicate the tendency of close political alignment of US and Israel. Next slide, please. In terms of the construction of the United Nations in general, it consists of the 6 principal organs, which are General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Secretariat, International Court of Justice, and Trusteeship Council, which is currently inactive. But for this research, only 2 of the most relevant are the Security Council and General Assembly were used for discussing international peace and security. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, and it consists of 15 members. 5 permanent members are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And 10 non-permanent members are elected for 2-year terms, and they often change. Permanent members possess the veto power, meaning that any of them can block the adoption of a substantive resolution. How it works: the Security Council discusses international conflicts, negotiates draft resolutions, adopts legally binding resolutions, and can impose sanctions, may authorize even the use of force, but only under the UN Charter. So for a substantive resolution to pass, at least 9 members must vote in favor, and none of the 5 permanent members may cast a veto. The General Assembly is the main deliberative and representative body of the United Nations. Unlike the Security Council, it includes all 193 UN member states, and every country has 1 equal vote, regardless of its size or power. And General Assembly debates global political, economical, and etc. issues, adopts resolutions, approves the UN budget, and supervises many UN bodies. However, its resolutions are generally recommendations rather than legally binding decisions. And this difference matters because the Security Council has the legal authority to adopt binding decisions, but that authority is constrained by the veto power of the 5 permanent members. But General Assembly represents all UN member states equally and can express the collective view of the international community, but it usually cannot legally compel states to comply with its resolutions. Next slide. So the problem is that negotiations take place in the United Nations Security Council, but their functional value to be translated into collective action is weakened, as the veto power represents codification of diplomatic deliberations and institutionalization of normative diplomatic practices. As United Nations Security Council is the main place where countries discuss international conflicts and try to agree on solutions, but during these meetings, states negotiate, exchange proposals, draft resolutions, but discussions alone does not solve conflicts. Consider that any of the 5 permanent members can use its veto power to block a resolution, even if majority of the council supports it. And as a result, negotiations may produce agreement among most members, but no official UN decision will be adopted, so the discussions do not become a collective action. So official decisions all UN members are expected to follow are not being followed. And the example of that can be that countries negotiate on ceasefire, a resolution ordering ceasefire is drafted, but 1 permanent member vetoes it, and therefore ceasefire is not adopted as a UN Security Council decision. Then countries may agree during discussions, but without a resolution, those agreements are not formally recorded as binding Security Council decisions, because it is important to put the results of negotiations into an official UN resolution or legal document for it to be considered. And if resolutions are repeatedly blocked by vetoes, practices such as humanitarian access or ceasefire or negotiated settlements cannot become consistent Security Council policy for restoration of peace. Next slide. The first argument that I presented in my research says that deliberations in the United Nations Security Council are established on national interest of dominant states. It may sound like a realist perspective. So the veto power granted to them allows those states to politically condition the outcomes of negotiations, and it undermines their value of impartiality. Although a certain perspective prevails among the majority of United Nations Security Council members, merely one vote of a permanent member against this perspective may dismiss it completely. According to Article 27 of the UN Charter, for any resolution to be adopted, there must be several compulsory conditions, and one of these conditions is that all 5 permanent members must have no discrepancies over the fact that the resolution mustn't be rejected. In case of draft resolutions of 2025, which are 583 and 353, they were both vetoed by the USA. A permanent member state possessing the right to condition diplomatic deliberations and known to be positively inclined to Israeli objectives since 1960s. And this tendency of US decisions to make the adjustment of voting towards US and Israel interests evident due to the application of the veto right. For example, draft resolution 1060, vetoed solely by the US in 2017. It didn't declare Jerusalem as Israel's capital and requested negotiations over the status to correspond to previous relevant UNSC resolution, even though all of them adhered to a similar perspective on the matter. Then resolution 516, voted against only by the US again, it appealed for recognition of Gaza as Palestinian integral part, examination of the situation to assess the state of Palestinian civilians in Israel occupation, and might expose provocative Israel's actions, ending closure of movement by Israel. Next resolution, 773. It was proposed by Brazil and vetoed again by the US. It condemned Hamas, but didn't legitimize use of military force by Israel for self-defense. It called for humanitarian pauses, evacuation, and protection of civilians in Gaza that restricted Israel in consistent military operation. And next resolution 970, proposed by the United Arab Emirates, and it was blocked by the US again. It requests immediate humanitarian ceasefire that could halt targeting of Hamas after 7th October attacks. And further, the resolutions that are central to this research, 583 and 353, they're extremely similar to each other and partially similar to all previously rejected resolutions, based on their demands for lifting restrictions on aid, release of all hostages, ceasefire, but without highlighting the Israel's right to self-defense and direct conviction of Hamas, whose fault would prevail according to the US. Thus, the US blocks resolutions that constrain Israel's military actions more than Hamas, and that undermine direct negotiations between those states, make condemning of Israel policy legitimate, set binding international obligations. If the Gaza conflict is concerned, the voting outcomes on draft resolution not comprising US objectives follow a consistent pattern, so the credibility of deliberative diplomacy is questioned. Next slide. It also contradicts the standard of deliberative legitimacy, which requires reasoned discussion and accurate facts guided by convincing argumentation and not authority. According to this logic of argumentation, the outcomes of deliberative diplomacy are shaped by the most convincing points and not by the role of a state in the dialogue. So according to the UN Charter Articles 23 and 2, the United Nations Security Council arguments must be grounded on maintenance of international peace and security, sovereignty, and prohibition of force. So arguments presented with respect to those principles in draft resolutions can be deemed pretty valid. In international politics, arguments must fit collective interests and shared legal norms and remain internally consistent to be contestable to be valid. Thus, it could be argued that arguments for adoption of 2025 resolutions must have been divergent in those specifics in US perspective, So it can be deduced that US failed to be persuaded and negotiations resemble deliberative diplomacy. However, United Nations Security Council is a power-based institution, but all states must legally justify their actions with persuasion of the interpretive community. In United Nations Security Council Thousands meeting, the resolution claims were adhered to the mandate to preserve peace and supported by precedents related to termination of harm to civilians, which is fundamental principle to the right to life. Enabling of aid that was proposed because of empirically justified famine reports, hostage release, that is a universal principle from international humanitarian law. The US rendered the report by the Commission of Inquiry slanderous, questioning the trustworthiness of arguments. However, according to the report hosted on the US Congress website, US analysts recorded Israeli casualties to be 1,200 and calculated solely on the 7th October 2023 attack. Meanwhile, the same report claimed the Palestinians' casualties by 2024 constituted 41,000, which represents a massive asymmetry in scale. Referring back to the UNSC Thousands meeting, Pakistan, China, and UK announced that casualties reached 65,000 by 2025 on Palestinian side. Algeria conveyed regret for the deaths of 18,000 Palestinian children. That alone is still 15 times more than Israel casualties. Panama reported that in 6 months, 13,800 Palestinians were killed. Even though the US questioned the reliability of those numbers and the scale of the famine, all other countries argued that figures presented violations of international humanitarian laws and right to life that can be deemed necessary for self-defense or punishment of Hamas. Moreover, all states except for the USA were disappointed by the results of the voting, which reflected proportionality of 14 votes for and 1 against the adoption of resolution on ceasefire. Statements of each country conveyed that all of them were persuaded by the necessity to adopt this draft resolution except for the US. And this highlights the fact that arguments succeeded in convincing the extreme majority except for only one, which is US. And the exact same outcomes were composed in procession over draft resolution 353. Thus, arguments provided by all states countering the US point contained legal and normative reasoning. They were evidence-based, and most of the states condemned all parties that harmed innocents equally. So they can be perceived as valid. It also can be deduced that United Nations Security Council's ability to conduct fair deliberations is evidently weakened because a permanent member could use their veto power to discredit legitimate arguments, not with the force of a better argument of its own, but with the granted right to veto applied to uphold its strategic interests. Nevertheless, deliberation occurred, but the US hadn't been persuaded, meaning that the standard of deliberate legitimacy has been upheld to an extent that every previous deduction about deliberations being undermined is contestable. So a state has the right to assess all arguments, challenge them, and still disagree, which is justified by a failure of majority to persuade one state. Moreover, the fact that the majority was convinced by arguments doesn't make them automatically persuasive. So arguments could have been valid to this majority, but incomplete to the US, which is acceptable in negotiations due to the subjectivity of criteria for valid arguments. Even the UN Charter is vague in defining the validity of arguments, except for the common legal standards that can be interpreted flexibly. So the conditions for deliberative legitimacy to be maintained were retained too, because all relevant states had an equal opportunity to participate in the discussion. Even though 5 permanent and 10 elected members on the 2 years basis are the ones engaged in voting, other members expressed their position in the United Nations Security Council Thousands meeting, including Palestine. And Palestine is a permanent observer state and not a member. It can be argued that the US was open to orient towards mutual understanding, but the arguments haven't convinced it to change its views. So US was valid in rejecting the credibility of the report on procedural level. Next slide, please. Deliberative diplomacy had been conducted within the UNSC, but the capacity of the process to determine common grounds was limited as veto power produces structural asymmetry. Outcomes can be overridden regardless of the validity of argumentation, which doesn't abolish negotiations, but limits deliberative legitimacy. The US argumentation can be questioned based on the trustworthiness, as its data appeared to be selective on the thousands meeting. The US conveyed their demands for release of 48 hostages and attenuated the crimes of Hamas without emphasizing the casualties of Palestinians, which Israeli forces are accountable for. Even though the US could dismiss reports and the authority of an institution named Commission of Inquiry, it didn't rebuttal with its own empirical findings that might have discredited the data in the report. Even if procedurally permitted, it doesn't endorse argumentative quality required for the fair deliberations. Another issue is the non-member status of Palestine, which allowed it to engage in negotiations but didn't permit it to contribute, even though it is one of the most relevant actors in the conflict. Absence of membership neglected the criteria of inclusiveness because Palestine hadn't had real power to actually influence the outcomes of negotiations. Therefore, negotiations had taken place as standards of deliberative diplomacy were procedurally complied with, but a fair and supposedly impactful process was constrained by power politics, as the recent agreement hadn't been reached. So the membership of 5 permanent members cannot be altered unequivocally, or their influence cannot be temporarily restricted. According to Article 108 of the UN Charter, 2/3 of the General Assembly must approve the amendment to change the membership of 5 permanent members, and 2/3 of member states and all P5 must ratify it, which creates a closed loop. So one of P5 may not want to lose its status and can prevent that with its veto power. A possible solution would be to temporarily restrict the right to veto of a permanent member if it was proved that the member has a strategic interest in blocking resolution due to alignment with the party engaged in the conflict. So the decisions on adoption would be guided by the force of a better argument. However, even this amendment can be vetoed by any of the P5, and it's difficult to prove the intent of a state. So power politics in UNSC are arranged to support international superiority of particular states through the endorsement of the veto right of those states. Deliberative diplomacy, though, shapes negotiations within the UNSC, while normative diplomatic practices frame them. So the institutionalization of normative diplomacy has not succeeded because international political system maintain power imbalances, veto rights, and partial compliance with, and they all impede the implementation of normative standards and make them institutionalized only formally. Next slide, please. According to the Article 1 of the UN Charter, the normative focus of the United Nations Security Council is peace, security, justice, and human rights. Draft Resolution 353 appeals to universal principles, reflecting that states are not free actors, but judged against shared norms. It highlights the need to eliminate catastrophic humanitarian crisis and famine, which emphasizes human ethics. It insists on peaceful conflict resolution, which makes violence an illegitimate policy of states that use it. The content contains norms from previously adopted resolutions, so UN Charter or international human rights, humanitarian laws, customary norms, which are all codified legal references and universal principles that UNSC must rely on. Geneva Convention for Articles 23, 34, and 59 advocate for free passage of humanitarian supplies, prohibition of hostage taking, and relief actions if civilians lack supplies. Article 3, common to Geneva Conventions, emphasizes minimum human treatment with the right to dignity and medical help. Customary laws distinguish civilians and combatants, define indiscriminate attacks, unnecessary suffering, deny starvation as means of warfare, request protection of peace, humanitarian personnel. Thus, Resolution 353 includes ceasefire, humanitarian, security of civilians norms, exist institutionally even without adoption of this specific draft resolution because they are invoked in negotiations, recorded in laws and adopted by the United Nations Security Council. So norms frame ideas that indicate this course of negotiations, but their existence doesn't ensure that states will comply with them, obviously. So incentives for states to keep commitments based on reciprocity doesn't guarantee the enforcement of norms. Moreover, institutions like United Nations Security Council must adopt norms symbolically, but in practice, states might neglect them when convenient. So practical institutionalization of norms fails in case of Gaza conflict constantly, because humanitarian obligations hadn't been operationalized or are contingent in implementation, and resolution wasn't adopted, which doesn't make it binding procedurally. Next slide. In negotiations over Israel-Palestinian conflicts, norms are also instrumentalized, not internalized, and the conflict resembles the norm life cycle. At the cascade stage, the draft resolutions receive widespread acceptance. They need to vindicate reputation, drive states to demand compliance with universal norms described in the drafts to correspond to the international standards prescribed to the UN. And this happened in the 1000th meeting of United Nations Security Council, where all states agreed to human rights violations to be justified and condemned. However, the stronger the consensus has been, the more regressive compliance has become, though the cycle doesn't reach the internalization stage. By reinterpreting norms to justify its decision to veto, the US has an opportunity to delay institutionalization, so the demands of resolutions won't become legally binding. For the cascade to convert into internalization, conforming to demands must be automatic and violations mustn't continue. In the 1000th meeting, the US and Israel have an observable pattern to invoke norms strategically and call for conditional compliance, which doesn't allow for internalization or even institutionalization to be attained fairly. Next slide. Normative diplomacy premises also they believe that all states encounter moral responsibilities which bind them to common normative standards. So the veto eliminates that universality structurally, because the system creates two groups of countries, which include countries that must follow established norms and countries that can choose to follow established norms. Mearsheimer's claim, who is a realist, about international institutions serving dominant power interests instead of controlling those interests has been proved through evidence of the US consistency, veto, and resolutions containing appeals to normative standards of the UN. The General Assembly's activation of its veto initiative, a current mandate for debate whenever veto is cast, is itself an institutional acknowledgement that the Security Council is constitutionally paralyzed on the issues where it is most urgently needed to resolve the military conflict. So United Nations Security Council's failure to pass Resolution 353 on ceasefire was followed by the passing of the resolution by the General Assembly on 12th of June among 12 states voting against were US and Israel. However, the General Assembly's passed resolutions can't compel states to conform to norms like United Nations Security Council because they have recommendation character with moral pressure on states rather than legally binding pressure. So the United States endorsed some calls for a ceasefire like Resolution 2728 in 2024, but at the same time vetoed resolutions that would make those calls legally binding, like 2025 resolutions. And the US publicly referred to international law and has continued to supply Israel, which enabled it to execute the activities that the US itself denounced. So powerful actors can control political systems to achieve their goals, which contradict established standards of international law. Veto power weakens the effectiveness of negotiations by preventing institutionalizations of those norms even when they are collectively approved based on legal and humanitarian standards. Next slide. Main findings of this research include that the most visible limitation exists because diplomatic norms have been received permanent institutional establishment. Also, international human rights and humanitarian law is incorporated into 2025 draft resolutions. And these standards exist purely as rhetorical expressions which receive no actual implementation. It depicts that Security Council operates at the norm cascade stage, because the majority of people accept the norms but fail to institutionalize them, because permanent members frame the norms to validate their decision to veto, but avoid mandatory compliance. And the outcomes of negotiations depend on the veto power, and the decision-making process technically conforms to deliberative legitimacy, but deliberations are constrained by power disparities. So all permanent members have the power to veto any resolution, which requires only one member to block the resolution that persuaded the majority. And power distribution determines the results of deliberative diplomacy, which proves to be decisive than the validity of arguments presented. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict proves that the negotiation within United Nations Security Council exists, yet these negotiations have fundamental limitations which prevent their outcomes to be enforced practically. The participating members conduct their discussions, yet they establish consensus on both humanitarian issues and legal matters. And the existing veto authority stops these mutual agreements from becoming obligatory international agreements, and negotiations fail in the end to adopt and enforce binding means of resolution to the conflict due to the veto right, even if the collective consensus was reached with the force of a better argument. Next slide. The recommendations in terms of this matter is first, permanent members should refrain from using the veto in situations involving mass civilian casualties, genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. Then, whenever a permanent member casts a veto, it could provide a detailed legal justification explaining how the veto complies with the UN Charter and international humanitarian law for the sake of the force of the better argument superiority. Also, a permanent member with a direct interest in the conflict should voluntarily refrain from using its veto in decisions concerning that conflict to preserve the impartiality and credibility of the Security Council. Fourth recommendation is to reform the composition of the permanent membership to enhance the legitimacy and representativeness of the Security Council in light of the current geopolitical, demographic, economic, and political realities. Because United Nations Security Council permanent members were formed only after the Second World War, and a lot of time has passed since that. And the last recommendation is to strengthen the Uniting for Peace mechanisms issued by the General Assembly and granting General Assembly resolutions binding legal effect, where the Security Council is unable to act because of a veto. Next slide. Thank you for your attention. My presentation is finished. Now, if you have any remarks, anything to add, criticism, whatever, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, dear guest, please, we can start the discussion. Questions, remarks, comments, your opinions.
I see some questions in the comments. From Tolikan Ismailova. Leading NGOs and activists, including partners from Ukraine and Palestine, are calling for reforms to the UN Security Council in times of crisis, citing aggression and wars. Do you think it is possible to influence the decision makers regarding the current UN Security Council mandate? I think it is possible to persuade some members of General Assembly, but of the Security Council, I don't think so. Because again, 5 permanent members may block any proposition or resolutions. Role of the OSCE plus Helsinki 50, EU and UN HRC. I think
Human Rights Council. UN Human Rights Council.
I think it might prove useful to look back at the Kofi Annan proposal of 2005. Thank you for this remark, but I'm not informed in this matter concretely. I'll be in use words. Okay, so questions in the chat are finished. If you have any remarks to make right now, please feel free to do so.
Thank you very much, Inzhu. I think it was new for Kazakhstan when the youth, like you, providing some research about the reform of UN Security Council. We will follow the news. And our plan also created some discussion within UN. So we hope it can be in this autumn. Also, maybe in Warsaw, as Mr. Bronner already wrote in the chat. Thank you, Mr. Bronner. So I see Ms. Tolikan Ismailova. Please.
Hello,
Tolikan.
everybody. First of all, I want to say thanks to Inju because you know you long time ago, and thank you for your initiative. I think it's very key questions regarding Security Council situation. And I'm old human rights defenders. Every time I surprised at why Human Rights Council slept and don't give any reaction. For example, when Ukraine has difficult time from aggression, from war, from Russia. And, it's gaps when politicians and key people who create decision-making process don't understand real situation because in rural area, for example, in Kyrgyzstan or Central Asia, today I met with gender expert from Uzbekistan, Irina, and we discussed about same woman, why this war? Why this aggression and systematic impunity growing? And thanks to Dr. Stefan Bronner, you participate in our discussion, and we want to say thanks to you also because we forget it. We forget it by European Union, by UN system, and we are living near China, and Afghanistan also create difficult situation for women, especially for women, for youth movement. And I think this discussion and presentation unique, and thanks to our youth movement, especially for Inzhu. And I think terrible situation. And last year in December, we put Mandat, a documentary film from Swiss documentalist and human rights defenders and advocates, Stefan also from Switzerland. And I think we should continue this discussion. And I hope Civic Solidarity platform led by Sasha Romantsova, by Alexandra Matvichuk, and by our great members, we should think about our strategic paper. Maybe we will give influence and to US, and because US is father and mother of democracy. This is my opinion, and this dilemma with me, with our friends, with our solidarity network. And I hope after this presentation also Kazakhstan and Central Asia activists will give key recommendation for OC, because OC plus Helsinki Declaration also should work, but I'm surprised for systematic impunity. Thank you.
Thank you for your remark. I really appreciate your feedback. And now what I want to say may sound very radical, but it's my right to express my opinion. It's my right for self-conscious. So I will say that US has never been father and mother of democracy. It built its democratic principles and their construction of the government on imperialism from a long time ago. So I have never thought that, but it's my personal opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for representative
Thank
of
you.
the US Embassy. Ms. Laura Delegada is here, so we appreciate your time and participation here. And of course, we respect you and your state, but the opinions can be very different and polarized. So thank you very much. If someone want to take a floor, please. So if not, we really appreciate for your time.
Nara,
Yes?
Stefan Bronner.
Stefan, Mr. Bronner, please.
Dr. Stefan Bronner.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Ms. TINALI, for a very provocative talk. I learned a good deal. I'd like to make one or two suggestions, which are, shall we say, strategic. I think I like your proposal about the General Assembly taking over if there's a veto on the Security Council. I think that's quite right. But I think in order to do that, one has to first have some kind of proposal put forward for how one changes the makeup of the Security Council, because otherwise you get into this loop. You want to say that the General Assembly should intervene, you put that forward as a resolution. The Security Council looks at the resolution and denies the veto. Denies the principle, and there you are. I think the first thing is, this is why I raised the Kofi Annan suggestions. Basically, what he offered a set of alternatives. If I remember right, there are 3 of them, but all of them speak to basically adding people to the adding members to the Security Council, and that some should be elected for or brought in for a certain number of years. Others, which would be temporary members, others should be brought in as fixed members. If one were to change the structure of the Security Council, your very fine proposal would be made much easier. So if you put this forward, I think you should put forward also some kind of statement about changing the Security Council. And there are a lot of precedents that you and your colleagues can look at. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. I think it's a good reason to continue this research further. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you for all of you for this event, a small discussion. So it's just only when we are started this race to this topic, because we are very want to be useful from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan, as a part of civil society to be useful on this matter. Yeah, thank you very much, and I hope we will meet soon with the next part of your research, Inzhu. Thank you.